It's an honor to be able to spend some time with you. Mm. I wanted to start with this slide, like to say that this story I'm going to tell you is not my story, the work isn't me, the ideas are not mine, but it's the combination of, my friends, lovers, theory I read, people I meet. Yeah, the work of hundreds of people, and so acknowledge that. And what I like about the opportunity to speak is that every time I pass the story to you, then it changes and things evolve and it will start leading into new things. Um, so I wanted to start. I'm going to basically in this talk give an introduction as to how I came to do this work of social practice, social art, however you want to call it. Um, and I'm going to talk a bit about my how I came to work with the group that is Assemble, and our work together over 12 years. And then I'm going to talk a bit about an organization I've set up since leaving Assemble last year, AB, which was mentioned in the introduction, and then finish by focusing on a project, House Veneta, which I'm doing as AB in collaboration with Assemble, and it's kind of like a multi-year project, multi-stakeholders, quite, yeah, it's very rich. And yeah, and then hopefully we'll have a chat. But yeah, I don't really know if anyone has a question while I'm speaking. Um, then okay. Well, anyway, it'll be fine. So, this is a picture of Rural Studio, which is a part of Alabama University, Auburn University in Alabama in the United States, where basically the students, it's kind of architecture, it's a part of the architecture school, and the students each year, as their final project, get to design and build and realize in the real world, like housing, libraries, the fire stations, skate parks, and they're really designing the world around them. And I had the opportunity to visit there in 2009, and it completely blew my mind because I was in my probably the same age as a lot of you. I was in my early 20s. I'd never seen the world being built by people who were my age, like by people taking action and having authorship of the city and of the space around them. And I helped out with building the skate park for a bit, and that completely blew my mind because suddenly I started to see and understand the labor that exists in the world around us and the amount of time that goes into creating it. And it's a kind of experimental place. But just to say that that was kind of a really pivotal moment for me. And then in London, a lot of like self-build projects. Kind of this is a project by the the collective Exist, a French collective in London. Um, but yeah, it's kind of Lido, experimental, like temporary structures. And this was a thing that I came back to London and started getting involved with. So this is a project by Practice Architecture, a kind of cafe and cocktail bar that's been running for now like a decade, on a rooftop in London called Frank's. And it was what was exciting about this moment was that people were starting to really um, just start to try and build things in the city. And I had studied philosophy and psychology, so I'd never really done architectural design work or was necessarily thinking I'd be working as an artist. But it was, yeah, just really incredible to see people like taking action in the city. So then I came into contact with a group who were thinking about doing a project, and over the course of 6 months, we developed our first project together, which was the Cineroleum, which was kind of turning a derelict petrol station into a cinema over the course of 5 weeks. And we did all the construction ourselves using the kind of infrastructure of the petrol station, sewed all these curtains, and then had this kind of, yeah, silver curtain around the outside. And you can see in the picture here, there's little people on either side here. So each of the panels could be pulled up, and when the film ended, then we'd pull on all the strings and the curtains would rise back up into the roof and you'd be back on the street. So I had this completely different relationship to film and and that part of the city. And a lot of it was experimental. Like there was no big overarching structure. We were kind of small groups, each taking little projects to think about how to make them and how to like source materials and labor for them. Um, and yeah, that was, I guess, the first time this group of people came together to approach the person who kind of owned the developer who owned the land and kind of propose this temporary use. And it was kind of self-organized, self-funded. So we all put like a small amount of money in, like £100, and then used that. And then a lot of our social and cultural capital and connections through work and projects we were doing, because it was kind of a voluntary thing. So we are just doing it in our weekends, and someone got fired and take holiday. And so it's everyone just in the spare time, really. But that was a really extraordinary moment. And so then after that, we started to try and build on that. So this was the second project that we did as a group, Assemble, which was trying to think about the fact that how to try and translate this idea that like the world is made by hand, by humans. Obviously mediated through machines often, but like it is humans who are constructing the world around us, and to try and think about how to represent that in a kind of built form, and also think about accessibility and resources and production. So this was a project where it was a very different situation, on the outskirts of London. The first one was kind of in the middle. And it was trying to think of a use for this space that was kind of overlooked and kind of beautiful, like underneath this motorway, had the light coming down, to try and think of a kind of narrative and a way and a reason for people to come to the space. And so we developed a proposal which was about this, a kind of, yeah, I guess like a stubborn landlord, the demolition is coming in, but one person is still sticking it out and doesn't want to be moved. There's a lot of old Victorian buildings around the area, so it was also trying to reference that aesthetic from the neighboring buildings. But obviously bricklaying as a material process is like not accessible, it's like a real skill. And yet we wanted to kind of recreate this feeling. So there was a design that was developed by us, which was this kind of timber bricks, all like woven back with basically different ropes. So it's kind of like a net that is attached to a scaffolding substructure. And so that meant that over the course of 2 months, anyone could come in and get involved. You can kind of see the ropes here hanging down, people weaving them on. It was about 15,000 bricks, and it was completely accessible. And it also meant that the process of construction was dry. There was no wet trades involved. So it meant that at the end, the whole thing could be dismantled and the component material pieces could be reused in another project. And I guess this is a way, in terms of navigating access to space and financing projects, or being able to build narratives around why you should be allowed to use a certain space, or getting more involvement from different community partners, is having multiple stages to the project, or like thinking about what you can use the material substance of the project for, and how its afterlife can also produce more projects and build more relations, bring children onto the site, this meant that the school kids came on site and did like some workshops as well, and then the material went to their school afterwards for permanent kind of play equipment. So it was a kind of temporary project we were kind of introduced to the site because there was a master planning project happening, and they wanted to work out whether or not this site would be of public value, of use. could be usable as a way of trying to then make an argument for investing in like permanent public access to power and water on site for facilitating future events. So it was kind of also like, I guess, a project that was an experiment for also the local authority, but the opportunity wasn't formed. So it was kind of like, yeah, we were kind of developing that proposal and how it would work. This project was also at the beginning of Assemble's existence, and I guess this early phase when we ourselves didn't have, we were just very much a kind of liquid group. It was like still forming. There's a lot of organizational shifts, and so we didn't have resources. We didn't really have a lot of money. So the projects were very much focused on. They were kind of, we were like building reputation, building trust. So a lot of the projects were quite small in scale in terms of the funding, but we were focused really on like how to do self-build projects and people to come in and get involved off the street. So this was a project for Cafe Otto, which is a kind of avant-garde sound venue in East London, really amazing program. And they have international artists coming every week to play and rehearse and develop projects in their space, but which is normally a cafe. So they wanted somewhere that people, artists coming, could rehearse during the day, and then people would be able to like also build and develop music projects, sound projects, improvisation projects during the day. So they had access to this site, and they didn't have very much money, but they had a huge community of people who were like completely committed and really big fans of their program. So what we did was try to think about the materiality of the site. So it was just this rubble wasteland, and this kind of material, again, these like lines of materiality as energy and resource, and the people also as energy and resource, and how you might work with them to make something bigger than the sum of its parts. So yeah, this was basically then using the rubble on site to develop a construction system. So rather than most of the buildings in London are built with brick stock, and that's because in the early 19th century there was a lot of clay pits, and people were basically making bricks from the ground, right, out of clay. And now there's so much development that that's not really a possible activity or material extraction that makes sense in London today. But there is a lot of waste material, there's a lot of demolition, there's a lot of this rubble. So to try and think about what would it be to use this as the next kind of major kind of material substance in the city to build with, and how might you do that? So anyway, yeah, it was kind of it was experimental, using what was on site, and then kind of again trying to think about the process as a way of like, what's the process that is the most accessible for people to contribute to without compromising the engineering of the space. And we ended up with this kind of like rice sack construction process, and and then a timber roof on top. So it's quite a strange building that has kind of, the shape of it comes from the process rather than an idea of aesthetic. And yeah, I guess with Assemble, one of the things that was fundamental to the way that the group could evolve was the fact that because of the first project that we did with the cinema, we were in conversations with the local authority, like people managing urban development in a certain part of the city. We were contacting loads of people trying to find somewhere to put this kit, because we had the cinema, and we were like, well, we don't want it just to be in storage, like let's find somewhere we can put it and maybe we can operate it still. So we negotiated access to this light industrial space, which we called Sugar House Studios. And over the course of, I think about, 8-9 years, it became our home, and started off as something that was very scrappy, and we had to do a lot of work to it. And then over time, you can see on the right, we we had a cinema, we had a pizzeria, we had lots of spaces for material experimentation and testing physical things at one-to-one. So this was some panels we were making. You can see the kind of finished installation for Goldsmiths Centre for Contemporary Art. But yeah, it was also it was a kind of scrappy space, right? It was what was good about it is that it allowed us to test out physical ideas and organizational ideas, business ideas, to fail and then to like kind of rearrange ourselves. So this was a pizzeria that we were running for a while, which the pizza was really good, but for our practice, it was really bad because we just were putting all our money into the pizzeria and we weren't really interested in running the pizzeria. So then there was a shift towards actually trying to think about, okay, how do you make how does this ecosystem of this space become more coherent and start to actually like feed into each other and nourish each other in a way that one bit isn't just supporting the other. So then it became a place much more focused on different kinds of artists and designers to share space, and we've since moved sites and then moving site again. And then so the pizzeria was in this building here, you can see at the back. But there was always a kind of continual engagement with trying to work with the substance of the city that surrounded us, like in the immediate surroundings, like so this next door to our space, there was this empty plot. And so we developed a proposal which was to try and think about if there's a lot of large scale development, again in London, and land prices are really high, rent is really high, it's really hard to access space as an artist or as a collective, or so how might you use that space, development space, while it's empty when it's awaiting development? Because often it will just be phased. So we developed this proposal for Yard House, which is kind of temporary studio space that could be built, occupied, and then taken down and moved somewhere else and then built again. And the proposal was really like something that also learned from our understanding of our relationship to space. So when we'd been able to learn through changing our own space in Sugar House, where we were testing out these ideas for pizzeria and making and different things, the space that was rented to artists was very minimal. You know, it's like it's literally just structure, and then there would be like there's like a kitchen in the back and this central kind of like shared kind of grand hall. So people were really able to like change things themselves and like dictate what they wanted to do. And I guess this idea of the social act of construction became something that we were like really interested in. And this is a kind of a joke, this image, because it's like a barn raising image. Like community comes together and builds a big barn. Obviously, we're not actually building it in this image because there's someone passing a spade up to the top. There's no need for a spade there. But you know, it's this kind of way of talking about the power of collective moments of making your environment. I guess one of the main thing, well, a large part of the work with Assemble was also like learning how to work with one another. So there's about 20 of us who started it off, and then another, yeah, now it's got even a bit bigger. But over time, those people shifted a bit, and some left, and now more have joined. But yeah, like learning how to speak to each other, learning how to be in meetings with each other, learning how to listen, learning how to not take up too much space. All of these things are like really were fundamental to being able to like move forward with anything. And I think it's really, at least when we were studying, I think probably it's different now. I know that lots of universities and different courses and educational settings are also focusing on this relational work, but I think it's absolutely fundamental. Especially if you guys are going to be working, you know, with other human beings and you're trying to like get stuff done, like in solidarity. It's so important to understand, like, yeah, ways of working, ways of speaking. Yeah, so over the course of 12 years now, this has also changed again. We started off, Assemble was this kind of like loose collection of individuals, and then slowly it kind of became there was an like smaller group, lots of people went back to study, then people came back, and we had some forms of organizational structure and decision making, and then that changed, and then we started this thing where each project always had two people working on it. So there was always someone you could speak to about it. So you were never in isolation. And that's felt really important, really like, yeah, a huge thing I've tried to take with me in other work. And yeah, just different kind of evolving forms of organization, basically, as a kind of organism of like how we would work and all of these models had different kind of economic uh, relations attached to them in terms of like how did we earn and how that related to the projects. Um, but yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. And I think that fluidity and capacity to like respond also really was something that facilitated us to stay together. Um, as we were doing these projects where we were like trying to make change in the world around us and also to understand the mechanisms that form the city and inform our relationship to space and our agency or not, um, we really started to try and move towards also doing projects that were not just thinking about physical and material aspects of our lives or of projects, but also about the invisible architectures. So these kinds of relations, um, like yeah, activities, like culture that is provided for by a certain kind of organization. Like what does the organization reproduce in the world? And how does that relate to what then you're making physically? And how do these things loop back and forth? Because they do, but it's just invisible and difficult to unpick. But important to think about. And so, yeah, this was Liverpool. So this is in Toxteth, part of a community that we were they're still working with now, but yeah, it's been about 7 or 8 years of working in this part of the country. And it's a place that has had a very like dramatic and also very hopeful kind of arc of, well, not actually hopeful. Well, depends who you speak to, but it's been very like um yeah, difficult aspect of the UK urbanism, and I think is quite telling of the values that our country definitely places on finance and ideas of what is valuable in urban development. So there was the photos you saw before were of streets that had basically been bought up by the government. People been moved out and streets left like war zones, totally like boarded up, as a way of trying to think about, it was called Housing Market Renewal Initiative, and it was basically a kind of nationwide plan by the Labour government to improve people's living conditions by basically destroying communities, evicting everyone, demolishing everything, and rebuilding housing less dense. So then the housing value would go up because there was less of it. And people would get gardens. And, it was about, there were other values at stake, but fundamentally it was also about like the market and about the like kind of commercial value of these properties as a way of improving people's lives. Whereas actually what happened was they bought up loads and loads of housing. The financial situation wasn't possible because it was so big. A lot of developers tried to do these projects, they went bust. Then we had the 2008 crash. So like basically people were moved out of their homes and these houses just stood like this for decades and decades, and they just slowly demolished them, but often they were also just left to rot. So we were introduced to working with this community group of some people who were living in these streets who did own their own houses, so couldn't be bought up by the state. And they're mainly actually older women, grandmas who were worried about the fact that because the state was going to demolish their area, they'd stop doing any policing, they'd stop doing any like waste collection. So there's just people like dropping rubbish everywhere. So they started to take the matters into their own hands, like where there was like no care by the state, they wanted to extend their like love and care from their own homes out into the neighborhood that they loved and that they wanted to protect. So they started like painting the houses, growing trees and plants around on the streets. And they also started a market on the street to kind of replace some of the shops that had been demolished. and also created a community land trust, which was a organization to basically try and take back some of the houses and have them in community ownership. So we worked with them to develop a kind of series of proposals for the neighborhood, like learning from conversations with them, learning from conversations with lots and lots of different groups who are operating in the area, and trying to like make a proposal or make some sense of something that wasn't just like one idea for this area or one proposal, but it was like multi-stakeholders. So part of that work led to the winter garden. So these were some of the houses that were in the worst condition, where the water had just rotted away the house. And to try and turn it into a space that could be a community space that basically could facilitate and continue the work that had been so transformative with these residents taking ownership of their streets and stopping demolition. And that was like, one was planting and gardening, and the other was creative action, like kind of, yeah, tenacious, kind of proactive street art, essentially, like claiming the space and playing with it. So this became a kind of community center now that is like both for like community arts and also for gardening and like teaching those things. It was basically putting a glass roof on the top of these two adjacent houses and then having a garden in it and a kind of larger meeting space, and also a little flat for renting out so they could start to like also cover their own costs and stuff, which felt really important because the community doesn't have money to be spending on the house in perpetuity, so they need to have a way of like being able to continue to maintain it. And really these projects were like a series of smaller opportunistic moments, all interconnected. So we also worked with them to then design 10 houses that they'd got ownership of from the state, and to develop it as like affordable housing. So to like do completely minimal finishes, working with like very like, yeah, easy trades. And we moved into one of the houses on the street. So the whole house became a kind of part of the project and a part of the infrastructure for producing the projects. So we were like sleeping upstairs. Downstairs in the front room became the kind of site office where the builders would have their meetings and stuff. This was in the back. One of the neighbors set up a cafe and was making a lot of food and also providing, selling food to the people working on the street, doing up the houses. And then in the back, we set up a kind of concrete fabrication space, like a studio, using some of the waste materials that were coming out of the houses and repurposing them to kind of have a second life back in the homes and to celebrate this kind of narrative of reuse and like protection of the houses. So yeah, using like slates and bricks and sand, whatever else we could find, and then making this kind of what we called Granby rock to make the fireplaces and countertops. And so that was kind of one project that was going on. And those moments, there was also a series of other things we did in the house that was trying to also echo this like handcraft care, this personal value that the residents had taken to their streets, and to reflect that in the way we were designing the home. So it wasn't just like every house was the same, but there was a way of showing like, hand, like, yeah, finish and difference in each one and kind of uniqueness and change. So we set up, so basically there was a bunch of different objects we designed for the house, which included these doorknobs I'll show you pictures of, and tiles, and they were all kind of different. And from that project, we were then nominated for an art prize in the UK, which is quite a big national event in the press. And so we tried to think about, okay, if we're going to accept this nomination, what do we want to use this moment in time for? Because you get to do an exhibition and thousands of people come to see the exhibition. So we tried to use that platform as a way of then starting a new project, which was using all these different things we designed for the houses to create a business, to start reoccupying one of the houses on the street and to make jobs for people in the local community. And so, yeah, we launched Granby Workshop and had a whole range of different products and working with lots of different artists and craftspeople from the local area. So we were making things like these were the fireplaces in the house. There was these bathroom tiles, which were made from decals, but everyone was kind of, a kind of experiment. And that was always the practice of that manufacturing organization, was to try and think about how do you start to make things in a way that also introduces chance, introduces improvisation, so that the labor of it and the involvement of people in it is still a creative act and still has some capacity to play and shift and change what it is you're producing in the end. And that slowly over time, the organization still exists now, still mainly focusing now on architectural ceramics, but it's moved now more towards trying to think about how you balance that idea around improvisation and play to also engaging with like mass production and like things at scale, so making things on repeat. And so it's moved into a lot of like recycled clay bodies and developing new kind of designed from waste material and different pigmentation. And this was a project commission that it did for the Venice Biennale, with a kind of floor design. And then all of those tiles were then relocated for a permanent installation. Again, trying to not ever just make things for an exhibition, but trying to think about what is the opportunities within that space of that the art world creates of bringing money, bringing attention, being able to produce things, and then how can those things go back out into the world and lead to other kinds of work. So this is now permanently installed in a garden in Venice in another arts institution. So yeah, there's this kind of like threads that go through the practice as we move, and like it is this thing of both being able to understand retrospectively, like looking back and being like, okay, these things actually we can see this was a value, or this is what we were trying to achieve, and like how do we bring that forward into something else? And then again that shifts, and so we kind of go from this like idea of like visible handmadeness to then how that might move into within the workshop, this individual creative act for products, to then like how that relates to being able to make a kind of proper sustainable manufacturing business, and then how that might then move towards like employee ownership. And yeah, now it's completely independent of Assemble. There's like someone who's on the trustee board, but all of the people who are working on that project at the beginning have kind of stepped away, still supporting in kind of informal capacities and related like research things. But yeah, it's owned by the employees. And I guess because a lot of the people in Assemble had studied architecture, I thought it'd be interesting to share this with you, which maybe isn't so relevant in your context because you're not necessarily constricted by the idea of architectural practice, but just this idea of like a professionalization of making stuff happen in the world. In UK, there's this workflow, plan of work, it's called, for architects, for the Royal Institute of British Architects, which takes you through a series of stages 0 to 7 about how you work and how you design and how you move towards something from being defined as a brief to being in use. And this is really shifting now, but it feels like, I think probably a lot of the work you guys are doing is something that I'm doing, which is related to this stuff, because obviously we have to engage with the built world, right? We have to relate to the spaces we can or can't occupy, and those inform the things that we do and the ways that and the communities that we're working alongside and within. But that to use these ideas of process or of like scope of work, which are much more about like technicality and physicality, but to try and explode those and like multiply them in different dimensions. So you have like need, you have different forms of value, you have organizational design, you have different mediums of narrative building, you have maintenance, you have like practices of care. And so I think it is, for me, it's really interesting to think about architecture as a kind of very institutionalized, very professionalized form of kind of a mirror of like what we don't, what I don't want to be doing, but it's an important foil to kind of look and respond to. I think as someone who's working in social practice. Um, so another one of these projects that was really much more trying to explore those ideas in terms of thinking about organizational, relational work as well, and business, as well as like also community space and making things possible, is Black Horse Workshop, is a kind of public access workshop space, really trying to think about, it was like a public library for tools. So a space where, and this is much more common now, I guess, with maker spaces and stuff, but that was quite early on. But to have a place where people could come and, you know, there was you could go in and sit in a cafe without having to have any particular skills or need to be making anything. But then you're in an environment where people are really like starting to make things with their hands, doing fabrication, like material experimentation, and that those things start to spill out into marketplaces and to wood storage. And there's kind of like hybrid spaces that are like purposefully trying to like cross-fertilize different ideas and different ecologies of people and communities as well. Um, Baltic Street Adventure Playground was another project that sought to try and think about, yeah, the way that we relate to space and its reproduction and like our empowerment in that. So this was a project that we did in East Glasgow, which was a really bleak urban environment, like huge master planning projects, so much demolition. You can see that a lot of the area was just like surrounded by this hoarding, like kind of fences, so you can't see what's going on. And we got a public art commission that was actually related to this building here. That is sorry, I'm just thinking about timing. 10:30. Okay, I'll try and speed up. This was a project that was a public art commission for this velodrome here, which was a building that was developed for the Commonwealth Games, which is kind of other parallel thing to like the Olympics, but just for Commonwealth countries or former Commonwealth countries. And there was a public art commission, and it could have been like a statue or it could have been a billboard or something. But having spent some time in this area, we felt it was really, really important to try, and we were struck by the fact that like in this environment, things are happening on a scale of time that if you're a kid in this place and you're growing up surrounded by this stuff, like your whole childhood could just be only this, like just surrounded by these like hoarding and like things going on that you aren't allowed to, you don't know what the communication is really bad, you have no idea what's happening. So we started looking at the adventure playground movement and this idea of self-authorship of space, which was like really connected to the experiences we'd have with self-build and like making projects happen, but was a kind of tradition in Europe at least, and it also exists in Japan and other places, but that in Europe came out of kids playing with kind of waste materials out after the Second World War. And it's led to the creation of playgrounds where kids the all over the place, many different countries, are still like really rebuilding their own spaces every year. And so we wanted to create a space that was, the project was designed as a way to try and think about this idea of like visual connection and like ownership of the space by the kids. So they were on site from day one, even before, whilst we were developing the designs, as the works was being happened. So it was like phased and they were still on site, but on the other side. And it was like really like not, it was kind of also an exercise in designing and like designing ourselves out of the role of designer, because it was not for us to be like, oh, this is going to be your play environment. It was to try and create a set of conditions and a site that meant that the kids could continue to like build, destroy, re-edit, be in charge, make decisions in that space. So it's like a holder for them basically to do what they want. So that's the design. It's like, how do you create that space as a possibility? So yeah, there's a lot of, it's now about to turn 10 years old. It's led into lots of other strands of work, kind of research about child-led spaces all around the world. both play spaces and also political spaces, like child-led political movement in South America is really strong. And I think really important to just remember that the ways in which we decide how people are or aren't allowed to engage with space, or how people are and when I say people, I mean children specifically in this situation, but also other kinds of marginalized communities are, contained and like segregated from, in particular ways of activity, from other parts of society. And so how do you start to think about what that does to people's minds, what that does to people's experience of agency? So yeah, that's been a really big part of my work over the last decade as well. So this is what Assemble looks like now, which is much more complicated, as I'm sure you can see, than like the beginning. But yeah, so it's like basically a partnership in lots of different companies. And then there's these like satellite projects that we've set up over time. And I've talked about Granby Workshop, I talked about Black Horse, Baltic Street Adventure Playground. They're all kind of become independent organizations as we set them up over time. Yeah, and some of these projects also fail. So this was one we did in Holland. It's important to recognize that. There's a project in New Orleans trying to think about a fashion school. But through all of these pieces of work, there's kind of objects and actions and lines of inquiry. Because it's a collective, lots of people have different kind of interests, and then those things start to intersect with each other. I'm not going to talk about this because I'm going to move to this. Well, yeah, I became increasingly interested in this idea of reproducing the world as you experience it. And so actually being aware of the fact that at where you choose to, or where you have to spend your time, informs the way you think, and then informs the way you act and behave and move, and can imagine possibilities. So just to kind of reorient myself, spend a lot of time researching different projects around Europe, where people are trying to enact different relational realities that aren't just ones of neoliberalism or extraction or capitalism, but like trying to model other forms of ways of relating. And I think this is really important especially when you're doing work in relation to buildings or to physical spaces, that you start to question what these things, that everything is really, that you can see everything as contingent. This is a picture of, obviously, I'm sure you can recognize, like a prehistoric tool. It's man-made shape, but up until only like a couple of hundred years ago, at least in this country, there was the idea of evolution was unknown, and so these objects were thought of as thunderstones, as acts of God. They come from this other place. We're not accountable. It's just like this kind of totally other history. And slowly we learn that actually we've been making these things, and you can look at them with a different eye, that they were also the product of human action. And I think that I like that metaphor to take to the world, that you can think about the ways we're relating, the ways you guys are gathering in the space, the way you're forming your education, the way you speak to each other. These are all human decisions. And so to then try and like think about how you are also a part of systems and how you are reproducing them in your own self. So yeah, over the past 10 years, I was working with Assemble, mostly architecture backgrounds, as I mentioned, and I've just been becoming more and more frustrated with the situation with architecture as a kind of tool in the production of capital and the reproduction of a very unequal society, and like bad extractive material practices that affect the world. And so I started this organization called AB last year. This is our business plan. And the idea is to try and like think about every kind of component part of an organization, like from the business plan to the way we hold gatherings, to the way we structure our organization, as something to also interrogate, something to think critically about, something to work with, that we're not just reproducing the same dynamics, same structural issues. So yeah, this was the business plan, and it's kind of somewhere between this like prayer, like meditation pattern, and also like a 17th century like lecturade, which on the right, this is basically an amazing print where they used to have these, it was like, if I was doing this lecture for you in the early 18th century, this is what I would use to talk about ethics. So it's like a figurative representation of ideas. through people and architectures and space, but like talks about the interconnectedness of those things. And this one's talking about, yeah, logic and philosophy of science. But so we made one which is basically a kind of like all of these ideas that we've been having for AD and like how those things are going to interconnect. And so far, it's mainly been a lot of meetings and conversations. The idea is that it will be decentralized, so it will have multiple different arms that are doing different research projects. And we've kind of got a Discord. People have started doing projects around sonic architecture of A&E and trying to reflect on what we should be doing at this moment in time. I think it feels really important that it's also transdisciplinary. It's not attached to a professional context. So then the idea is that you don't have to be like, oh, well, this is the way we do things. Like, this is the way we use technology. It's also a thing that can, as these images do, show like beautiful, beautiful maps of the moving of the Mississippi River over time. And to think about, yeah, at different moments in time, we actually need to be doing completely different kinds of work. We need to be using technology in completely different kinds of ways. We need to be navigating conversations between communities. Like you need to be thinking about how you can access resources and make things happen in ways that are evolving. And so I'm really interested in, yeah, this idea of practice doesn't have to be architecture. It could be like your practice as social. I feel for me, architectural practice is the same as this like social art practice, or it should be. Good architectural practice is critical of the systems and therefore is the same as what you guys are doing for me. So yeah, it can be abolitionist, it can be therapy, it can be thinking about therapeutic. It's a long form therapeutic practice with a different medium. It can be feedback, it can be auto theory, talking about your own experience, lots of different things. So how do we expand these concepts of profession? So then, yeah, these are just, I'm going to not really talk about these because I'm going to run out of time, but yeah, so we've been doing projects looking at the asylum system in the UK, which is completely abhorrent. We're doing projects thinking with queer groups, campaign groups about access to nightlife space and how you can reorient power dynamics through the way you're designing the methods of your projects. And then this project I'm going to finish the talk by talking about is House of Annetta, which is a project I've been working on for the last couple of years, trying to think about how you use a resource like a house as a tool and a resource and an actor towards a kind of idea of systems change, towards like ideas around like land justice and spatial justice. So the house is like 5 floors, and the proposal is to basically over the next number of years turn it into a centre where people are engaging with ideas of spatial justice and able to use it as a resource. It's in East London, so it's in a place where there used to be a huge amount of like working class and industrial activity, like a big brewery, lots of kind of trading of vegetables and fruit market, and also has a very important and like powerful history of migration. It was a place where the word refugee comes from in the English language because Huguenots were French Protestants seeking refuge. There's like a French word, refuge, into this part of East London. That was in the early 18th century. Then a huge Jewish community came from Eastern Europe. And then more recently in the 20th century, then because of the British Empire, huge numbers of Bengalis have settled in the area. And it's become kind of famously like Curry Mile and Banglatown. And there's been like lots of really inspiring movements of anti-racist work and political organizing as a result of this kind of like energy and diversity that's come to that area. But we're now at a moment where so basically the project is here on this street here where the arrow is. And over here on the left, you can see there's a yellow, that's the city of London. So we're like right next to like one of the global centers of like capital and, you know, the effect that has on like land prices and on development. So these are all huge developments that are happening in the area, current and ongoing. It has meant that over the course of 20 years, probably 30 years actually, 30 years, the area was in a mess. Like it was very, you know, lots of derelict buildings, things being demolished, like lots of like kind of industrial labor practices, making, I mean, there was a lot of work there as well, though. Making leather jackets in the house and stuff has turned into this, which is this kind of like totally sanitized, very gentrified area, at least on our street. And a lot of old buildings that are being kind of gutted and then rebuilt as empty malls. So this is the house, 4 floors, double fronted, and Assemble was approached by the Edith Marion Foundation in 2019. The Edith Marion Foundation is a really interesting organization that was set up. It's Swiss, so it's based in Switzerland. It was set up to basically try and decommodify land and property and stand against market speculation. So they hold spaces and land assets or buildings in perpetuity. They will never, never, never sell. And so people can't speculate on them. So you can't, prices don't go up, people don't get pushed out. And they have never had a project in the UK before, so they approached Assemble. They have lots of different projects all over Europe, but they approached Assemble. And because of our experience of how important it was to have access to these spaces, like in Liverpool, about people having security of housing, in Glasgow, about kids having security over that space to be able to continue to build a culture of play over a decade. We wanted to turn it into a space that could really speak to the rarity of the fact that this organization didn't want to make money out of this building. It's like completely unusual in London, and I'm sure probably in Hong Kong as well. So this is kind of what the house was like at first. It's still pretty much like this. Semi-derelict. The house is listed, which means it's protected in the UK, so we can't legally just start to make changes. We have to go through like another layer of process called listed building consent and, draw out every single tiny change we want to make to the space. So what that means is that the repairs to the space are going to be very expensive. So we're trying to raise grant money so that we don't have a big debt on the building. And so basically we proposed to the foundation that we would do the same thing that we did in Liverpool, where we're kind of living on site, whereas now we're based in London, so we don't need to live in the house, but basically move in to the house and start to occupy it and open it up to the public as a way of like learning about the building and what it could be used for. So over the past 3 years, we've really, 2.5 years, been running like public programs, residency programs, opening it up for organizing, having food events, poetry readings, film screenings, research projects, loads and loads of different things. And we've started to learn a lot about the woman who lived in the house before, who was called Annetta Pedretti. I'm just going to wrap it up in 5 minutes. I'll be really fast. 3 minutes. So she was an incredible woman who studied architecture and then became a cybernetician. So cybernetics is the study of self-regulating systems. So of systems, she was working with systems in terms of publishing, how you co-author a book, how you design a method of conversation exchange to produce objects. So she was doing that with books, she was doing that with flags, she was doing that with clothes, she was doing that with community campaigning, she was doing that with beekeeping. We've started to map out all of the different things she was working on in the house. So she was really like critical about the idea of land, actually, and about access to land, and was using her house as a way of escaping capitalist time and as a way of learning how to learn. And we're trying to like continue that practice by using a lot of the things, the like jigsaw puzzle that she left in the house, basically of like started projects, started conversations, and using them as prompts to continue conversations about systems, about, multiculturalism, about community beyond divisions of identity, and also about craft, because she was building the house a lot herself. So anyway, it's a long and complex story, but if any of you are ever in London, please get in touch and come visit. It's like a really beautiful space, and it's better to experience as a project in it, firsthand. And we're trying to basically deliver it in a way that engages with spatial justice at many different levels. So we're setting up a charity that will take the lease on the property and hope to try and be the Edith Marion Foundation for the UK in the future. So to try and start to do what they do, kind of like a franchise, but like McDonald's, but for land justice and decommodification in the UK, because they're not really interested in continuing to expand. And so maybe over a decade, if we finish the house project, then it can start to hold land and property in other parts of the country and start to grow. It become a free space for exhibitions and campaigning, a space for education, critical thinking, community, food, and also a space for thinking about alternative forms of economics. And really, like, we're at the moment now where we're just trying to, negotiate the lease with the foundation and build relations and a kind of culture around the space so that we can access money to do up the building, which we want to do through a kind of training program. So every piece of work that we're doing in the house, every small piece of like fixing or infrastructure, like enabling works to let the public come in, we're always trying to make sure that that's got some educational or experimental aspect to it so that people normally marginalized from like traditional craft construction, like women, non-binary people, people of color, can start to get those skills, and it becomes a place where people are engaging with theory as well as construction. So I'm going to stop there. But yeah, thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you for your sharing and how it relates to how it like very distinctly relates to the idea of like, you know, community art, engaging community, and kind of a socially engaged practices through like even the financial products of architecture, right? And kind of thinking beyond different forms of organizing and spatial justice, which we haven't had yet for these 2 days of conversations. So thank you so much for that. And of course, there's a lot more. I guess the context of UK and maybe some other people would have some questions about how you would land these ideas within the context of Hong Kong, or what kind of exchanges that may have. Maybe I can pass it to the floor to see if there's any questions. We'll take about 2 questions due to time constraints. I see someone over there.
Thank you, Fran, for sharing. And I have a question: is like, how do you see your roles different in relation to the stakeholders in your different projects? So can you like give us maybe a few examples? Because I know like definitely even in one project you may have like so many different roles when you are like facing different stages or conditions. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what is interesting about the role is that, I mean, at least for me, the role is one of trying to have perspective on like the interconnectedness of things and what is at stake. Like, what can you do in any situation? Like, where are the social resources, the physical resources that you can bring to make something that makes sense in that place, and for it always to be about listening to the context and the reality of what people are experiencing in a place, not to ever have an idea before and to bring it. Yeah, I guess it is interesting because sometimes that means, you know, you're kind of doing research or different forms of documentation, and then other times it means your skill or your role is really to like use a way of telling a story through like the composition of how you are gathering images and narrating that back to people with power or people in decision-making places in the state or whatever. And then at other points, you're also kind of a co-creator or a collaborator with working on the same level as the community to like make stuff happen. So sometimes you're kind of working for them, sometimes you're working next to them. And those things can also be blurry, like they're not necessarily different, but I guess to make sure you remember like not to assume you know the answers of what you should be doing in your role, but to know that you are bringing skills that are also valuable, like that people can use, and like how do you use what you as an individual have experienced in your life and also what you've experienced in school and what you've experienced in your work to think about what you can bring to a certain situation. So yeah, I think I try not to think about role in like a disciplinary sense, but it's more about the kind of context and situation. Yeah, that makes sense.
Thanks, Fran. Oh, I also want to mention you can ask questions in Cantonese or other languages that I might understand.
Hello， 我想問條問題，咁樣係關於點講呢？係assemble 最初都係可能結構好散，或者都係好多人一齊做嘢咁樣。咁究竟係咩原因令到成件事可以大家團結到一齊做到咁耐呢？同埋點解就算可能你有唔同嘅組織方式啦，點解大家都會願意繼續喺呢個地方度一齊付出咁樣？
So Chris was asking, yeah, Assemble has a lot of different kinds of people, and also wanting to know how you can work together for such a long time, and also work in that particular context that you are working in for, and how do you kind of negotiate with one another? Yeah.
That's a great question. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it is. It is really difficult sometimes working with people because human beings are complex. And yeah, but also that's it's also the best way, or the most powerful way, you know. Your collective power is like so much, you can achieve much more than just the sum of your parts as an individual. So it is worth it. It doesn't mean it's easy or like not tiring, and yeah, there's a lot of negotiation. And I think just over time, you know, at the beginning we were really bad at having meetings. We used to talk for like 5 hours just to have one meeting, and it was appalling. And like now it's just like probably too far the other way, but that's why I left. But yeah, I think I guess two things I would say, and I've been having a lot of conversations with people where I am at the moment. I'm at a land justice gathering for movement building in the UK. And one thing that feels really important is that you have an shared understanding of what it is you're doing, like why are you doing something together? And if you kind of believe in that, then, and you're acting from a place of love, then you can, you know, just what I think Assemble hasn't really held conflict very well. That's not what it's really done. But there was kind of enough trust and friendship that it managed to continue. I think one thing I would say now, and that I'm going to that I've learned while I'm here just on this weekend, and I'm going to take back to the House Veneta, is a thing to basically like try and like not celebrate, but see conflict as an amazing opportunity to learn and to actually make space for the conflict, but to ritualize it, to make a ritual space where this becomes a place where you're entered in and you're interacting with in a place of, in love. And you know that everything that was brought to that space is going to be something that is trying to make whatever it is your values that you're trying to get to, you're trying to get that together. And I think, to have that space as a ritualized space where there's like a marker of creating that space, people are welcomed in, and then you leave it. And you know that if you have this conflict space and you leave it, then you can also just go back to work or go home. And, you know, it doesn't have to be this, it's not an individual thing. Because I think often the issue with conflict is that, you know, we individualize a lot of the issues and we blame each other, but we're all existing in these systems which are like reproducing trauma in us on so many levels that we're also inheriting from like many years back, and like, you know, put so much pressure on all of us from like time and labor. And so I think to keep that in mind whilst we're also trying to work together it's delicate, but you just also someone told me something recently which is really good, is that, you know, it's like human beings have worked out to build beds and kitchens because we know that we like to eat and we will need to eat and we need to sleep and we will sleep every day and it will happen. But conflict will also happen, but we somehow like never build the space for conflict. We never like set it up until, you know, it's like often organizations only start to self-organized groups only start to organize how they will deal with conflict or build infrastructures for dealing with conflict when they're having conflict. And that, you know, you don't want to build a kitchen when you're hungry. It'd be horrible. or like, you know, like, so you just, yeah, try and think about it beforehand if you're working with people and like come to some agreement before it emerges, I think.
Thank you, Fran. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, friends. Thanks for your sharing. And it's really exciting to see like how materials are being used like in a social way more than just like aesthetic. And like as a Hong Konger, when I see those, like when I see your works, Assemble's works, my first thought is like, how could that happen? Like that's not possible in Hong Kong. Like I was immediately thinking about, okay, will that be legal in Hong Kong? And I was just also like looking at, trying to Google like UK's like building codes, like, but obviously the PDF is too large to load on my phone, so I gave up. So like, I mean, because I was also looking at Assemble's background. It was founded by a group of like architects, but not professionally, like not with a license. Architects without a license at the beginning. So there was, I felt like there was a kind of like a rejection or denial towards the professional system or institutional approach of doing architecture at the beginning. So that's what I felt during your presentation. And like gradually I saw that the group got the Turner Prize and also got commissioned for Goldsmith's Art Center. So it was like gradually getting more large scale, like I felt that. So as people who might initially think about like rejecting the system or thinking of an alternative, like how do you navigate between like scaling up and also retaining your like flexibility or being organic? Like how do you mediate through these like relationships throughout the years? Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, I think it's such a good question. I mean, I thank you for that. Yeah, that is exactly what's happened. And that was one of the reasons why, on a personal level, I felt like I needed to move and start this AB project because I wanted to still continue to be quite, detached from the professional approach of architecture. And architecture is changing in the UK. I mean, there are a lot of good conversations, but also the bulk of it isn't. I think, what I would say is just, I think it's good to understand, like, I mean, you kind of asked me two things. Okay, I'm going to talk about the ambition and aim, like, non-professionalization / systems critical thinking as one thing, and then I'm going to also answer your question about, respond to your question about Hong Kong in the context of that. I think basically you guys, I'm assuming, are all fairly young. And so you'll be in like a particular moment in your lives, right? Where probably most of you don't have kids. Most of you are living in a certain living situation, which will shift over time. You have less caring responsibilities than you will do in the future. And things will change. That doesn't mean your politics or your idea of like idealism or like criticalism has to shift as well. But it just means that things that you're working within will change. And your cohort will also change. And I think, I mean, it also is totally individual, I think. And some people, you know, with just different experiences, different responsibilities, different interests, and that's also totally fine. So yeah, for some people within Assemble, like a lot of people are now qualified as architects, and that means that they can approach working on commissions in like for larger scale public buildings and like institutional clients. And other people in the group aren't interested in doing that and trying to think more about like materiality and like supply chains and housing. And other people are working on like public parks and more like growing and educational projects. So it's really a mix. But I guess, yeah, the thing I think it's good to just keep checking in with yourself, like whether the thing you're giving your time to is doing the things that you really want it to be doing in the world, or whether that starts to become a kind of rhetoric that doesn't really reflect the reality, and to try and be honest with yourself about what you're doing. Not just to say it's doing stuff when it actually is just not doing that and is doing something else. Then with the Hong Kong question, yeah, I mean, I've only been there once and a very short time, so I can't comment on on the complexities of, or with any nuance about, like, I'm sure what you guys, are living in and through, and the systems that you're engaging with on a daily basis. I mean, I don't think that you would want to do what Assemble does where you are, because it wouldn't make sense, right? It's a different kind of work in a different kind of place. There will be aspects of it that maybe you're interested in, like kind of themes or ideas that you can bring to your work and to your situation. And the building codes and the restrictions of, or like power of the state will obviously just be very different in your situation. But it doesn't mean that there aren't incredibly powerful things that I'm sure are already happening, but it will just look different. It will take a different spatial form, right? It will have a different relationship to the land that is available. And like, I mean, I'm thinking about it now, and like, yeah, what you guys have been dealing with is like extremely, I mean, as is the world, right? Everywhere is different. So I think it's just, yeah, important to like think about your own principles, to think about which battles you want to fight and which ones are going to just take your time and energy and not go very far. So to try and be smart also about that. And yeah, I think thinking about resources for the longer term, like thinking about how you can access land, thinking about how you can access space and try and secure that in different ways, in like experimental ways, even in temporary ways, but like moving towards less temporary ways. That is really fundamental. And even if it's tiny spaces or spaces outside of the city, or, like further in different kind of contexts, or mobile space, whatever it might be, there will be ways you can find things. And those will be, the more relevant and the richer, because they're coming from your experience and from that place. So, yeah.
Thank you, Fran.